My name is Bob Holben. Glad to be here and talk about objects and a prototype chain. Generally, a lot of the topics at the Atlanta JavaScript meetup group tend to be like new cool features and different libraries. Tonight I'm going to step back and talk more about some foundational topics. So a lot of this stuff will be good for people that are newer to JavaScript, but hopefully buried somewhere here, even if you're pretty advanced in JavaScript, you'll find something interesting. And I'll apologize a little bit. The awesomeness of this screen, how big it is, people in the back maybe can't see, maybe below there. And I know a lot of my slides fill the screen pretty well, so sorry about that. If you go to slides.com/bholben, you can pull it up and watch live with me as well. Man, I'm gonna go farther. Maybe we would get the whole screen up. I started this talk, actually I put it together last year for, I did this at work, and it germinated from when I went to the Connect Tech conference last year, Connect.js. Kyle Simpson does a workshop on JavaScript and objects, and if you take the 4th or 5th book out of this series, and you dive into it, it's a free online book. You go to GitHub and look up Kyle Simpson's books. You can look in there and you'll see this diagram that he builds to show how object creation works when you go through the inheritance approach with constructors. And this kind of interested me, and I thought, I want to try to figure out how to make this diagram a little bit more readable. So this is what I came up, and it looks horrible on this screen, but it really is improved in my view. I've come up with this approach to putting these objects together, and this is the end game that we'll work towards tonight. But we'll walk through, and ultimately what we're doing is talking about two things: creating objects and then relating the objects. So let's get into it. Just a little bit of background: the TC39 committee. And Brent and I, that's the foundation and history of what drives JavaScript forward. But then there's these other characters around the perimeter that really influence the community as well. And there are a lot of dissonant voices. Douglas Crockford's always been a big dissonant voice for JavaScript, even though he's been on TC39. Eric Elliott is one of the loudest complainers about class in JavaScript. Kyle Simpson kind of follows that as well. And then there's this other guy, Matthias Johansson, that in the last year, he does a weekly 10-minute YouTube clip typically. If you don't follow his YouTube clips, you should. And I'll reference a couple of them for tonight. So let's go back to the beginning of JavaScript. Brent and I famously created JavaScript in 10 days in 1995, and it wasn't until 1997, after Netscape kind of hit the nuclear button and released it to open source, that ECMAScript was created or available to everyone. And at that time, there was really two ways to create objects. The manual approach of just using the object literal, and then you have the automated approach of using constructor functions. So we'll kind of go through each of these. And I guess I'm lying a little bit because there's really more than one way to do automated. You can also use factory functions. And we'll loop back around and talk about that at the end. But for now, I want to talk about just these two approaches. So first, the manual approach. This code, if you've done just a little bit of JavaScript, should hopefully look somewhat familiar. Real simple concept of creating an object. The constructor function, same sort of stuff, just put together a little bit differently inside of a function. And ultimately, you call the function with a new keyword, and you've got instances, as many as you want. So that's the automated approach. But we're in JavaScript, we like to do things that are memory efficient. So sometimes most of the time we break out methods or functions and attach them to the prototype. But the code starts to get just a little bit uglier. And if you want to talk about inheritance, it gets even uglier. I'm going to talk first about traditional JavaScript. Eventually I'm going to come back around and talk about modern JavaScript. So let's dig in a little bit. this is what got me looking, trying to understand JavaScript when I first started. I looked at this code for inheritance. And you can't even see my yellow arrows on the screen, but basically there's 3 lines in this code. This line, and this line that just really hurt my head when I was learning JavaScript. It's code if you want to do an inheritance object. You've got to just copy it, learn it, go to MDN, copy it from there. I don't think many people necessarily memorize this the very next time they've got a project and want to do an inheritance. So that's the traditional constructor function. But ultimately, there's 2 abstractions that came along. So in 2009 with ES5, Douglas Crockford pushed for object.create, which gained some traction, but it never really has dominated. And then with the latest version of ECMAScript, ES 2015, we've got the class syntax and the extends operator. We'll go through each of these. But first, let's kind of build some foundation for creating objects with these diagrams. First, I want to talk about the terminology inheritance and the word delegation. So this is straight out of Yedify or Kyle Simpson's work. Inheritance is when you copy properties from. Delegation is when you link properties to. So copying properties down from or linking properties up to. That's kind of a slight variation on something that's very similar. And a lot of people will mix the 2 words. I'm pretty much indifferent on using the 2 words. Some copy mechanisms in JavaScript when you use factory functions, object.assign, or new, and I'll talk about each of these individually in a few minutes. Some link mechanisms in JavaScript, the object literal, object.create, and again, new. You'll notice I go back. New is on both the copy and the link, and that's one of the chief complaints about using new in the constructor in JavaScript. It's mentally a little bit more to think about. So we talked about delegation. Now let's talk about object.prototype. So today there's 13 functions or methods or properties on object.prototype. That's the base that we build all of our objects to. And all I've done is taking, in Chrome, I've done a console.dir. And all the properties you see there, I just stuck them in the box up top. I've taken 6 properties over to the left that are more commonly used properties. I've taken the getter, setter stuff, put it in the middle, and then I've separated constructor out to the side because it's a little bit different. We'll be talking about that. I want to take this box and shrink it down so we can start growing some objects. Let's first create an array. So built into JavaScript, used to have maybe 7 or 8 different built-in prototypes. So we've got string prototype here, function.prototype, array.prototype. And there's more. There's number.prototype, regex.prototype. Like I said, there used to be maybe 7 or 8 of these. With ES 2015, I think we've got at least twice that now because we've added the new promise API. We've added all these new data, set, and these others. I'm going to focus right now just on these 2, function.prototype and array.prototype. Let's shrink them up the same way. And now I'm going to create an array constructor. This is all the built-in JavaScript still. You'll notice plain objects, I'm using this rust-colored brown, that's plain objects. So the object.prototype up top and array.prototype, these are plain JavaScript objects. The purple boxes are function objects. If it's a purple box with a colored band around it, that means it's a constructor. So we've got plain objects, function objects, and then constructor function. You'll see I've got chains connecting everything, so that's kind of symbolically, that's the prototype chain. And then we've also got prototype shooting to the right and constructor shooting to the left. In engineering world, with electrical schematics or mechanical mechanisms, you see this ground symbol, and you can turn it right side, upside down, whatever. You can think of this top beam as ground in JavaScript. It's the ground that everything hangs upon. And you remember I said that there's a color band around constructors. So when I construct a new object, when I say new on it, the convention I have here is I'm using that blue color to show the new array, the instance that was created in my constructor. And we could create more instances. But the code I have here, hopefully nobody's really doing this. This is what we could do, but the more conventional way to create an array is to just simply do this. And we're taught at the beginning when we learn JavaScript, do it this way. Most languages we're taught this way. And the reason, I think, the reason we're taught this is it allows you to abstract away and forget about all this other stuff. It simplifies things. You just know that you've created your array. You've got two properties in it. Well, two indices, and then you've magically got this length property. And if you call this array and do something on it, if your function isn't in your object, well, you climb up the prototype chain to array.prototype, to the 30 some odd 40 methods that are there. If it's not there, you climb up to object.prototype. Let's move things around a bit. And let's do console run this thing and start opening it up. So there's our array. It's represented inside the blue box. If we go down or up the prototype chain, we're going to the next level. We open, I'll call it Dunder Proto, borrowing from Python terminology. We keep expanding, and we're finally up to the top. So that's a quick example using arrays. Let's talk a little bit more about these three words that are bouncing on. So Dunder Proto, prototype, and constructor. Let's start again with our three base built-in prototypes. Let's look just at function prototype. I want to shrink it down and add chain on two constructors. Let's shrink that down. And now let's look at what the pieces are. Man, the graphics are horrible up there, I apologize. So the chain, again, it represents the prototype chain. In the ECMAScript specification, that's spelled out as bracket prototype. Mozilla with Firefox years back came up with Dunder Proto. Dunder Proto is better because it's publicly accessible. That's what we can access to do things. And then finally, I think mostly because Microsoft never bought in and IE never had Dunder Proto. Eventually, with ES 2015, object.getPrototype was made available, and all conforming browsers now do this. And then Dunder Proto, actually, if you look at the MDN docs, you'll see it's being deprecated. But all these words that we use for the prototype chain, you can't confuse that with the actual prototype property to make things a little bit more confusing. So the prototype property comes off of the constructor function. So the proto chain is a property of all objects, whether they're brown or purple or whatever, right? But the prototype property is only a property of constructor functions. The constructor property is the opposite. It's a property of all prototypes. So we can start to see something here. If I start in the object.prototype, I'm up here, and then I come back down to constructor, I just made a big loop, right? So some of these crazy lines like this start to make sense. Okay, this is what's happening. I'm basically just training JavaScript to travel between these boxes. Function.prototype, Same thing, I start in this box, dot prototype, go up, and then back down, dot constructor. There's a quick quiz. Anyone want to dare to say what the answer is to this? Which box am I going to end up in? Function.constructor.prototype. Okay. Function.constructor. I'm starting in function. There is no constructor. It's going the wrong way. So I climb the chain. I come back down. So function.constructor actually brings you right back to function. And then .prototype, I'm back up. So this craziness, this is one of those lines in that inheritance code that annoyed me a lot when I was first learning this. This is why we can open up a function in the console, open up prototype, open up constructor, open up prototype, open up constructor. You can just keep doing this forever and ever, right? This is what's happened. We're doing this circular loop. I'm driving my slides with my phone. I guess I need to touch my computer once in a while, or else it's going to take time. Okay, let's create some custom objects. Most of what we've done so far is just the built-ins. I wanted to kind of lay that down there, and then now we'll talk about automation and inheritance. So here's what we know, here's what we've done so far. Let's write some code. So function animal, what are we doing? We're creating a function constructor, and inside that constructor there's a prototype property. You can think of the prototype property being inside this box. All I've done is pull it out to the side. And I've pulled it out to the side so you can clearly see there's a chain that connects it up to object.prototype, because it itself is an object, a plain object. So that's animal. We can write this several ways. I use function declaration. We can use a function expression. The only real difference here, I think, is the name property. It's an empty string because it's anonymous. And then a third way is to actually call new on the function, and that brings it down in a different way. And that's really what's happening behind the scenes. No matter how you do this, I think that's what's happening. And you see each one of these has a different name property. But for now, for tonight, let's just talk about this kind of syntax. Function declaration. All right, so another line of code, we've added a property onto animal. So the property lives inside that prototype. And now we're saying, okay, let's create some dogs, inherit them off of animals. The very first line of code, nothing here tells it that it's related or inheriting, so we have to add a second line. And we're going to move dog.prototype underneath animal.prototype when we add this line of code. And this is object.create, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. But it moved the chain. Now our prototype chain is linked up to the correct thing. That's what object.create does. It connects your chain. You tell it where to connect the chain. But one thing object.create doesn't do is constructors. So let me go back for a second. You see we had prototype and constructor between these. And when I add that line of code, I've lost the constructor. So we need to retrain it how to put the constructor back. And that's what this line of code is. So dog.prototype.constructor equals dog. We've built the circular loop back in. And then the third line of this, I'll call it ugly inheritance code, is to allow the constructors both to be accessed when you're instantiating new dogs. And maybe we add some properties to dog.prototype. Okay, remember the function constructors, or the constructor functions, they have the color band around them. So when we instantiate with new, we're just relating these two together. So that's just my convention for showing that those objects are instantiated from a certain constructor. All right, so there's the code. The most simple, I kind of just faked out a bunch of stuff that the minimal inheritance code will say. In traditional JavaScript that we've all written up until hopefully now, with ES2 2015, we're switching over to something else. And that something else is either object.create or class and extend. So let's go through each of these and start comparing and contrasting. Object.create, remember I told you we're going to talk about object creation and relation. So object.create is more about relating objects together. So typically you're going to marry that up with some other mechanism that creates the object. So right now I'm just showing the object literal. So we're going to work with object literals and object.create. So what does object.create do? Before we can answer that, we've got to ask ourselves, what does new do? And then we'll back into this answer. So this is straight out of Kyle Simpson's book as well. So step one, it creates an empty object. Step two, it links up the prototype chain. Step three, it binds the this context to the constructor function. And then lastly, as a convenience, it returns this. Typically when you write constructor functions, you don't put a return in. If you do, you're going to probably mess up this part of it. But by returning this is just a convenience that allows you to method chain. So what does object.create do? If that's what new does, it abstracts away the last two pieces. It just does these two things. So it creates an empty object, and it adds the prototype chain. How does it do that? This is, I think, Douglas Crockford's blog, I think in 2006, he wrote about this, and eventually in 2009 this was incorporated into ECMAScript ES5. But it's a function that does these three lines. It's a constructor function. It identifies whatever you pass into it, it calls that the prototype. And then it returns it. It moves the thing up and returns the instance. So it abstracts this stuff away. So it abstracts away the constructor function. There's our constructor function. You don't see it when you use object.create. It abstracts away the prototype method. It abstracts away the constructor method, because if you don't have a prototype, you don't have a constructor. And it abstracts away the new operator. You sometimes hear people argue that you should use one or the other, whether it's new or constructors or object.create. If you look here, it's all the same. Under the covers, it's doing the constructor, the prototype, and the new. So there's no sense in necessarily arguing about that. It's all the same. It's just abstracted away. So let's walk through and show the 4 steps with new first. So create the object. Add the prototype chain. Bind the this context to the constructor. And then return this. I don't have a good graphical way to show that. But that's the 4 steps. That's basically what's happening behind the scenes. So object.create with its abstraction, what is it doing? Well, step 1, it's basically hiding all this stuff. It's translucent on my screen, but you can't see it at all. It took away everything behind because we've abstracted it away. So get rid of the noise. Take the prototype property off. So this was animal.prototype, dog.prototype. Let's just knock that off because it doesn't really serve any purpose in this context. And since we're using just plain objects, there's no need to use capital case. And then ultimately, we're using plain objects, so we don't type things when we use object.create. which is probably the most debated point of object.create when you use this approach, is it takes away typing. JavaScript's version of typing. So if I write this line of code, create the object, add the chain, and there we've got everything in one line of code, I guess. So if you're using the constructor functions, you've got a parent class, you've got a parent prototype, a child class, a child prototype, and then you've got your typed instance. If you're using object.create, you've just got objects all over now. There's the code side by side. This is basically, I'll call it 1997 code versus 2009 code. But let's look at the other option, the newer option. Let's use class and extends and the new operator. I'm going to just cut straight to the code. So there's the constructor code again, and there's the class code. Pretty similarly, it's a lot shorter, a lot easier on the eyes. Instead of just comparing these side by side, let's go straight to comparing the two modern approaches side by side. So syntax, very similar. I've cheated a little bit. On object.create, I'm actually using the Lodash version, _.create. That just simply allows us to group all of our properties together. It looks neater and tighter. When you look at the console dir, object.create doesn't show any constructors. It doesn't have any. Class does. Just a little bit more noise there. When you look at the mental model, object.create is just a very one-dimensional mental map. Class, there's a little bit more to think about. Performance, this is always changing with each engine, constantly being re-optimized. But class is so popular that it's always going to get a lot of attention. It beats out object.create in performance, but if you're writing front-end code, this should probably not be an issue for you. You can see this is 2.3 microseconds versus 1.6 microseconds. That's not 1,000, that's a millionth of a second for each instance, so it's just, generally it's not a factor. If you're writing back-end code, maybe it is. If you're doing some kind of game that requires an incredible amount of instances to be created per frame, then maybe it is. So, this is a link. If you want to go watch this YouTube clip, he's much more entertaining than I am, and all his YouTube videos are typically under 10 minutes. He does a really good explanation of this. Object.create doesn't have typing. So we have to use stuck typing. So if Fido has a method called bark, then Fido's probably a dog. It's kind of the way that works, right? With class, you can use the instance of operator, but that's a dangerous operator because if you're inheriting from something else, you'll also maybe be fooled into thinking that it was created from animal. So instead of using instance of, as long as you haven't broken your constructors, you do it like this and you get a more surefire answer. And going back to object.create, if typing, if you want to fake it in, you could put in his dog and his animal property at each step of the way if you wanted to as well. So let's talk about prevalence. Object.create really hasn't caught on like some wished it had. It's just not as common, and the industry just never took it seriously. That's my feeling on it. Class is all the object-oriented languages use class. So JavaScript is the big misunderstood language because it doesn't operate that way. So we use class here to make it feel more similar to other languages. It's just got big momentum. It's TC39 is basically saying this is the way you construct objects. This is the way, when you look at the frameworks, if you look at the new Angular, React, you see class used everywhere. So it's got a lot of prevalence. So just kind of summarize, side by side, object.create, the way we've done it, it's good with these top three. But most of the rest of the way, class, if typing is important to you, and if you go all the way with typing, like with TypeScript, then it's going to make a lot more sense. Prevalence we talked about. Now, both of these approaches use the prototype chain. And by using the prototype chain when you're instantiating a bunch of instances, you're being memory efficient. So they're both really good with memory, which isn't really that important these days in modern browsers. And you've got some level of privacy with class. But with object literals, you don't have any closure, so you don't have any real privacy. But both of these, ultimately, they fail when it comes to, they are inheritance. So inheritance, well, before I get into that, this is kind of the simple versus the easy, one approach versus the other. I think simple is good for maybe smaller projects or even medium-sized projects. When you get into big behemoth projects, devs definitely tend to lean towards tried and true class. All right, both of these approaches represent inheritance. So, but we're taught by the gang of four that we should favor composition over inheritance. So, what does that mean? And again, if you want to watch this video, click on here. This is a pretty popular video. That kind of explains along the way how brittle and why you don't necessarily want to use inheritance. Matthias Johansson will go so far as to say, don't favor composition over inheritance. He will say, never use inheritance. Okay, so class looks like this. The resulting object structure looks like that. Object.create looks like this. Graphics are terrible. So that's inheritance. But the question here is, what does composition look like? How do you do that in JavaScript? That's what it looks like. You basically want to take the methods from animal, the methods from dog, and shove them together and put them inside your do. We'll call it an instance. And you do that with the object.assign. And the console dir, when you create an object this way, this is as flat as you can get. There's no hierarchy. Everything's hanging directly off object.prototype. Really flat, efficient in that way, but maybe there's one level more you want to create. You can mix object.assign and object.create if you like to step things down a little bit. Let's do one last example with composition. I'll use factory functions for this. So a factory is simply a function that creates and returns an object. Looks like this. Just return an object, call return an object. It's a way to basically instantiate a new animal each time you call it. You can pass in properties. It feels kind of like class in that way. But because it's we're basically creating a closure, we've got a function or multiple functions. Inside a function, we've got closure, we've got privacy, we can put private variables up top, and I'm showing private functions as well. So it's a mechanism to create privacy, which was one of our negative items on our list before when we were talking about using object literals. And if you're writing Angular code, you'll recognize this is a factory in Angular. If you go back farther than that, you'll see it looks like the module pattern or the revealing module pattern. It's been around for a long time. So there's animal, there's dog, and if we use object.assign, we're basically smushing the properties together. The first parameter, I'm showing an empty object. That's pretty typical when you use object.assign. We're taking animal and dog and smushing it in there, and eventually we just get everything put together. The order is important. If there's a property inside of animal and a property inside of dog that has the same name, say init, the last one in wins. All right, I've reached the end. Hopefully I've told everybody a little bit. But here's a summary. Syntax is pretty good for all of these. Comparing them, console dir. I favor object create and object assign. It looks a little cleaner. It doesn't have the extra constructor in there. The mental model kind of goes along same. Performance, if that's important to you, you're going to favor class. If typing and polymorphism is important, you're going to favor class. Prevalence, class and factories, they're both strongly used and they'll continue to be. With memory, factory functions. Remember, I'm pairing the creation and the relation pieces together. You can mix and match these different ways. So it's tough to do a true side by side because I'm mixing approaches. But if I'm using factories, I'm not efficient with memory. If you're designing for some small little device that doesn't have much memory, then that's important to you. If you're designing for a browser, it's probably not an issue. Privacy, because I'm using object literals, I get a bad mark on that one. And then factory functions, that's the way to solve the fixed taxonomy. Because, I'm sorry, not factory functions, but object unassign by using composition. So I just want to put all this stuff side by side and these are the comparisons I've used when I look at the different approaches. But in the end, if you're doing something small and simple, maybe you favor object.create. If you're doing a more robust system and you want to have IntelliSense and this sort of thing built in, class is going to be a better solution. And that's all I've got for tonight. Docendo decimus. It's the best way to teach is to learn. So thank you for allowing me to share with you guys. Any questions?
Yes.
Comments? Criticisms?
Over here.
All right.
What's the name of the book you
You don't know JavaScript? It's actually a 5 or 6 part series, and if you look for you don't know JavaScript, just Google it. It'll take you to GitHub, and on GitHub you'll be able to. It's all free online book. Of course, you can buy the hard copy, and I'm sure Kyle would appreciate that. But yeah, it's all available free. I'll make sure and link this up in the meetup. Any others? Yeah. Yeah, the workshop that he gave last year in October at Connect.js, he's also, I just looked, he's signed up to do it again this year. And that workshop basically, it takes from that book, and then he also is one of the main guys on front-end masters, or if you go to Pluralsight, I've looked at it through Pluralsight as well. Yeah.
Can I see your slide on composition again?
Yeah, composition. I went really flat in this example. I just went straight across with just object unassigned.
Okay. I think splitting up the functionality between dog and animal doesn't really illustrate well the point of composition. Like, composition is more about, like, the relationship between animal and dog is really an inheritance relationship, whereas composition and decomposition is more about separating object into subparts of the object, or sub-objects. So the relationship might be more like a man, and a man has a head, and he's got arms, and he's got legs, rather than like animal versus dog is more of like, it represents the inheritance.
Yeah, I think that's fair. This structure is pretty well established between animals and dogs, but I've come to believe that if you truly want to innovate, if you're writing software and you really believe there's a hierarchical relationship between what you're building, let some time go by and you may change your mind. If you're saying vehicle, car, you know, and car has wheels and car drives and all these things. Give it a few years. A car has driver, car has steering wheel. You start composing these things into small pieces, I think you'll be better off in the long run, because Tesla and Google autonomous vehicles, everything's going to change. So the structure that you create today, give it 1, 2, 5, 10 years, it's going to change enough to where your brittle code starts to hurt you. So I'll give you animal and dog, but maybe some structures that you think you have right now, you won't in a few years. Okay, thanks everybody.